Let it go out on the road.
Senate will please come to order. Today, in lieu of devotionals, we will have a moment of silence. Please. Thank you. Are there any announcements? Seeing none, I want to make one brief announcement. From yesterday when we had a devotional, there was a fair amount of paper shuffling, and I would just ask that if we want to look at papers and otherwise maybe don't attend during that time, whether it's silence or devotional, just for folks to be able to gather their thoughts and focus. I would appreciate it. We do have any other announcements? Seeing none, we have two bills for referral appearing on notice for calendar for notice. H157, affecting the expenditures of the state, will be referred to the Committee on Appropriations, and H414, affecting the expenditures of the state, will be referred to the Committee on Appropriations. That brings us to the orders of the day. I believe we are passing over H227, which would bring us to H479. H479 was read for the first time, actually I believe it was put onto the calendar for action. And then it is now up for action for second reading, and then we will have some amendments. Please listen to the second reading of the bill.
H479, an act relating to the transportation program and miscellaneous changes to laws related to transportation.
Now you've heard the second reading of the bill. For the report from the Committee on Transportation, the Senator from Grand Isle, Senator Mazza.
Mr. President, today is your transportation bill, H479. Your Senate Transportation Committee brings you the largest transportation budget ever at $856.3 million. This represents an increase of 2.2% over last year's record-breaking $838.1 million. This record level of funding is driven by Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, a 5-year federal transportation bill that provides record funding to states, including a 30% increase in core highway formula funding, a new $225 million general fund bridge program, a new $21.2 million general fund electric vehicle charging infrastructure program, which we've all been waiting for. If we're going to have electric vehicles, we certainly need the charging stations for them. This year's paving budget is $141.6 million. 11th consecutive year that the paving budget exceeds $100 million. And we are making tremendous progress on our paving throughout the state. This represents 49 construction projects covering 455 miles of paving, 71 miles of rehabilitation to improve or widening shoulders in support of bicycle and pedestrian access and mobility. We have been leading that in the years for bicycles and ped. Every time we do a paving job or some structure improvement, we try to make sure that we focus on the bicycle and pedestrian access. The roadway project is up 5% with a total investment of $53.8 million, funding 25 projects to construct and reconstruct intersections and roadway segments. This year, the Federal General Fund Bridge Program will support increase of funding for the Town Highway Bridge Program to $37.2 million, well over double pre-funding levels for town highway bridges. This has been a tremendous help to town bridges throughout the state who need some financial assistance on their bridges. Additionally, the construction phase of bridges funded as part of the program will be at 100% federal savings town and state significant funding resources. Bicycle, pedestrian, and transportation alternatives program funding at $18.2 million will implement 55 construction projects and design of 37 additional projects across 77 Vermont communities. As you can see, it's widespread all over the state, and everybody who wants is getting a piece of that money. We continue our commitment to implementing programs to reduce carbon emissions from the transportation sector by investing $27.9 million across multiple efforts, including $7.6 million to increase the presence of electric vehicle supply equipment, which will lead to the installation of direct current fast charging along designated alternative fuel corridors. And that's where we're going to put an emphasis on, certainly to have the presence of the charging stations. $500,000 for a new Electrify Your Fleet program to incentivize Vermont municipalities and businesses, entities to transition to plug-in vehicles. And $50,000 for the e-bike incentive program. $12.8 million for the carbon reduction formula program also. Continuation of electric vehicle incentive programs. It's estimated that approximately $13.7 million from prior appropriations will be available in fiscal year 2024 for the incentive program for the new plug-in electric vehicles. To address revenue challenges posed by our success with greater EV adoption, we will provide $350,000 in state match and direct the agency to apply for a federal grant to work towards a substantial road and usage charge solution for plug-in vehicles. And that's an issue that we're working on all the time continually. Public transit will also receive historic funding at $48.8 million. Investments will include continued zero-fare public transit for rural local transit routes. We've been asked to do that, and we're trying to do as much as we can for use of public transit, and some will go back to charging in Chittenden County, I think probably next year sometime. 5.25 million in electric buses for continuing transit fleet electrification. There are currently 27 electric transit vehicles in operation or on order, with a plan to apply for federal funding to acquire 17 more. So we're certainly doing our part with electric buses, and that's what the community is looking for, and we're doing our best we can. $500,000 for the mobility and transportation initiatives, grant program to support projects that improve both mobility and access to services for transit-dependent Vermonters, reducing the use of single occupancy vehicles and reduced greenhouse gases emissions. The rail program will implement $43 million in projects, including $8.85 million for Amtrak passenger services, including a recent addition to the New York City Burlington Passenger Rail, which I might add is very highly successful. It's above expectations. It's proven that people are really using that service from Burlington to New York City, which we've been working on for many, many years. Continue work on a $20 million federal bill grant to upgrade rail bridges between Rutland and Hoosick, New York. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the continue work to bring our Department of Motor Vehicles IT systems up to modern integrated standards through e-permitting solutions in support of the collection of our transportation fund revenues derived from various taxes and fees. With that, Mr. President, I now yield to the Senator from Washington County, Senator Kirchlich. Thank you.
Senator from Grand Isle yields to the Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. As you'll notice, as we report this bill, we're going to jump around from different members of the Transportation Committee. And I appreciate the committee allowing me to report Section 2 is kind of out of order, because for me, this is, I think, the most interesting section of the bill. And I think what I would want to draw, if you're going to read any of the many pages of the bill, these are the 3 pages I would draw your attention to. This section is a section that was first added to the transportation bill in 2019, my first year in the Senate. I give credit to former Senator Ash for suggesting that we do this, because what this section does is just highlights all the parts of the transportation bill where we do anything to reduce our use of fossil fuels, move to an electrification of our transportation infrastructure, and support Vermonters saving money in transportation. So the chair in his introduction to the bill gave highlights of a lot of these sections. But if you go to page 2015, you'll just see all the sections where we're dealing with reducing our use of fossil fuels and making our transportation sector more sustainable. I won't read them to you, but there's one section I wanted to highlight that I'll be reporting later, but the numbers are in this section, and they're just referred to in the later section. This is related to the electric vehicle incentives that we have in the state. We're not appropriating new money. So I just wanted to give you what we think is money that's going to be available for fiscal 24, and they're listed on page 2017. That's $8.2 million for new electric vehicles, $2.2 million for the Mileage Smart, which is a program that helps low-income Vermonters get into a more efficient new vehicle, but or just more efficient a vehicle. Because we know transportation is just critical for getting to work and living our lives in Vermont. So this makes sure that they can save money. It might just get them into a Prius instead of a low mileage car. And then also $3.2 million for Replace Your Ride program, which replaces old inefficient vehicles with various different transportation modes that best fit the Vermonter. So again, I just want to point folks to that section just to highlight the good work that the Transportation Committee and our state of Vermont is doing in these. The $850 million that the Senator from Grand Isle mentioned is all in this book. So if you want to know about all the paving and all the bridges and all the signs and everything that we do, that's in here. But section 2 takes all those rolled out and gives you a chance to read them in one place. So that is your section 2, and I will now yield to the Senator from Essex.
Senator from Washington yields to the Senator from Essex.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Senator from Washington. I've been tasked to go through sections 3 through 6. Section 3 eliminates the 2 one-time appropriations proposed by the administration, $3 million in general fund monies for the Rail Trail Community Connectivity Grant and $3.5 million in capital fund operating monies for the St. Albans District Maintenance Facility. Section 4 talks further about the St. Albans District Maintenance Facility, and it actually adds a project to the transportation program, and there will be an amendment further on from appropriations that will talk further about that project. The same with Section 5, the Rail Trail Community Connectivity Grants, adds the Rail Trail Community Connectivity Grants to the transportation program. Again, there will be an amendment from appropriations that will further discuss those 2 programs. Section 6 cancels the Bennington Bypass project. Both the state, the federal government, and the community are no longer have interest in that project, and what it does by keeping it on the books, it does not allow the town to develop any other plans for the areas of where that project was slated for, and so therefore we are canceling that project so that should there be any desire from the community to do something in that stretch of property, they would be allowed to do so. Mr. President, at this point in time, I'd like to yield the floor to the Senator from Chittenden, Senator Chittenden.
Senator from Essex yields to the Senator from Chittenden Southeast.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll be speaking to sections 7 through 12. Section 7 has to do with the Transportation Alternatives Grant Program. It notwithstands a state statutory grant award cap of $300,000 for the next 3 years, fiscal year 24 through 27, to allow the Transportation Alternatives Grant Program to be awarded up to $600,000 per year for the anticipated remainder of the doubling of the amount of federal monies available for the Transportation Alternatives Grant Program under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA. Section 8 has to do with the Central Garage Fund. It amends codified law to align the state statute on how the Central Garage Fund could be used to align with current agency practice. It clarifies what's an allowed repair expense. It eliminates the prohibition on the agency from increasing the total number of vehicles in the fleet without General Assembly approval, and makes technical phrasing changes. It also expands the definition of equipment to match what is equipment, things like lifts in the garage and so on. Section 9 has to do with the Central Garage Fund as well, and it notwithstands codified law for state fiscal years 2024 through 2026 to allow for the amount appropriated from the Central Garage Fund for the purchase of new replacement equipment to be based on the prior year depreciation of fully depreciated but still actively in service equipment. This is a short-term solution for what is expected to be a short-term problem for the supply chain issues we are still correcting for, requiring the agency to keep equipment in service longer. Section 10 has to do with Green Mountain Transit and the plan for tiered fare service. It requires Green Mountain Transit to prepare a plan for the transition to tiered fare service on urban routes, some parameters of which are included in the T-bill, and include providing certain passengers with service at no cost or at a reduced cost to the passenger, and be designed based on reasonable revenue estimates to generate fare revenue at least 10% of projected operational costs on urban GMT routes. And to also advise the House and Senate Transportation of its plan by filing a copy of the final plan by December 1st, 2023, later this year. Section 11 has to do with recommendations on funding sources for non-federal match for public transit. Requires the Vermont Public Transportation Association in consultation with the Agency of Transportation and the Vermont League of Cities and Towns to provide House, Senate, and Transportation with a written recommendation on one or more funding sources for the non-federal match required of public transit providers by January 15th, 2024. Section 12 has to do with the statewide public transit system recommendations. It requires the Agency of Transportation in consultation with the Agency of Human Services Division of Vermont Health Access and the Vermont Public Transportation Association to conduct a benefit and risk assessment of the current system for delivering public transit and non-emergency medical transportation services, sometimes called the braided services model. The assessment needs to include a review of other approaches in the United States, make recommendations on modifications to Vermont's statewide mobility service design in order to make Vermont's public transit system as efficient, robust, and resilient as possible while fully maximizing available federal funding. Assessment needs to be filed with the House and Senate Committees on Transportation, House Committee on Human Services, and the Senate Committee on Health and Welfare by January 15th, 2024. At this time, I'd like to, if allowed, yield to the Senator from Washington, Senator Perchlik.
Senator from Chittenden Southeast yields to the Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. So this is sections 13 through 28. Section 13 just separates two grant programs to make it clear that the MTI, the Mobility and Transportation Innovation Grant Program, will be ongoing, separate from the Go Vermont $450,000 that we're putting to Go Vermont, which promotes a lot of the work that we're doing in the electrification and carpooling and all that kind of thing, but from the MTI grant program. The MTI program, I think, is a critical program. There's only $500,000 for fiscal year 24, but there's a lot of money that we had appropriated in prior years that are going to go to these innovative transportation programs. And I want to just highlight the microtransit programs that this innovation program has funded. So there's been a successful pilot project here in Montpelier, but other towns and cities throughout the state want to try out how they can meet their transportation needs of their citizens through microtransit. And that's like an on-demand kind of rural Uber, if you want to call it, that kind of situation. So that's what section 13 just splits those two out. Sections 14 through 21 deals all with our vehicle incentive programs. There's a lot of pages and sections here, but basically we're just taking the incentive programs that were in session law, we're putting them in codified law. We're also, the only real changes we're doing is we're giving the Agency of Transportation, as they operate these electric vehicle incentive programs, a little more flexibility so that we don't have to, if they just want to change the incentive a little bit or change the income level a little bit, that they don't have to come back to hear that. Because, during the off session, they might, if the funds are running out or if they're finding something in the marketplace that needs adjustment, we're giving them a little more authority to make adjustments to maximize the use of these public funds to meet the goals of those electric vehicle incentive programs. So that kind of gets you through 14, 15, 16. Section 17 is a new section that I think you'll hear about. This is the Electrify Your Fleet program. Before, fleet vehicles, which usually drive more miles, we realize that's where we should be prioritizing our electric vehicle incentives. So we have a special program just for fleets, and that gets added. We made some changes into the e-bike incentive program in section 18. We made some changes from the House, just about the minimum amount. I think one thing of note here is we added safety language. I don't know if you've heard in the news about fires caused by electric bikes, particularly in New York City. This has been a problem with a lot of electric transport bikes, with people leaving them plugged in, and then they catch fire. When these lithium-ion batteries catch fire, they're hard to put out, and it's caused a lot of problems. We wanted to make sure that any bike that's getting an incentive with Vermont dollars is UL listed and has the safety features that would help prevent these fires. And we reference both the UL listing and the European program, which gives us an opportunity to have an umlaut in session in the the statute book. So getting an umlaut in there was a success for me, I thought. This also, that was section 18. Section 19 authorizes the agency to change the income eligibility to the e-bike program, similar to the ability that we gave them for the electric vehicles. The section 20 through 22 frees up money in the Replace Your Ride program, $550,000, $500,000 for that Electrify Your Fleet program to allow for the incentives to go specifically for fleet vehicles, and then also $50,000 so we can continue to have an incentive for the electric bikes. Sections 23 through 26 is the mileage-based user fee. And you might have, there was some press about this. This is basically the committee and the Agency of Transportation trying to start how we're going to pay for our transportation infrastructure when more and more of us are driving electric vehicles. As you know, right now, electric vehicles, when they charge up with electricity, they're not paying the gas tax, obviously, and the gas tax is one of the main ways we fund our infrastructure. So there's a question, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to fund our transportation infrastructure if nobody's paying the gas tax? So we're seeing pressure on the transportation fund that we haven't seen before. So what this does is these sections just kind of put in place with the Agency of Transportation to study this and plan this out for future implementation. So it's looking at, this is only for electric vehicles, so it wouldn't change how internal combustion vehicle owners pay for the roads. They still pay the gas tax when they buy gas. But for electric vehicles, this looks at a mileage-based user fee model, which a couple other states have looked at. So this would, they have you pay a fee to the state for transportation infrastructure based on the number of miles you drive. But similar to the bill we passed yesterday, this has sort of a check back. We're telling the agency to design a mileage-based user fee, but not implement it. But the goal is to implement it in July of 2025. That's when we think like the revenue loss from these vehicles not paying the gas tax will kind of be critical to be receiving. So in 2024, we will get a report and a plan for how this user-based fee would be implemented. But we would need an enactment of law to actually allow that user fee to go into place. Because there's some controversy around it, and we want to make sure we're doing the right things. So we'll get the whole plan and the study next year. Part of that is also to look at hybrid vehicles, because hybrid vehicles do pay some gas tax, but they also use electricity. These are plug-in hybrids. So right now, the intent is that those hybrid plug-in electric vehicles would just pay an increased registration fee. The idea is a 1.75 of the registration fee of an internal combustion vehicle to offset the fact that they are driving on electricity part of the time. But again, it'll be required an enactment of law before that increased registration fee for the plug-in hybrids would go into effect. So that's section 23 to 26 dealing with all that. Section 27 and 28 deal with reporting, federal reporting that AOT is already required to do as part of the IIJA and the PROTECT program. PROTECT is the Promoting Resilience Operation and Transformation Efficient and Cost-Saving Transportation. And so under IIJA and the PROTECT Act, AOT is required to report on carbon saving reduction programs and plans. We just give them a little more language on those plans, and we ask them to report back to us on those plans. And we want in 2024, and we want recommendations on how those plans that they're writing for the federal government may or may not want changes in our own statute. So with that, I am going to yield back to the senator from Chittenden Southeast.
Senator from Washington yields to the Senator Chittenden from Chittenden Southeast.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll be doing sections 29 through 33. This has to do with complete streets. It makes technical changes and removes the language on what is required related to complete streets for certain state managed projects from 19 VSA 10B. Section 30 repeals the section on what is required related to complete streets for certain municipally managed projects. Section 31 codifies a chapter related to complete streets, adds a definition for complete streets. Section, which also adds a section for the state policies related to complete streets, and it addresses what is required of certain state-managed subsection A or municipally managed subsection B projects are not going to incorporate complete street principles, roughly analogous to the current analysis, but requires more transparency and/or a link to the forthcoming agency's complete streets guidance. It also requires annual reporting on complete streets and the maintenance of a web accessible and web searchable public data source of information related to certain state managed projects. Section 32 establishes a timeline for implementation of the public data source, and Section 33 requires the agency, in consultation with Vermont League of Cities and Towns and regional planning commissions, to design and implement a program to provide training on complete streets to municipalities. With Mr. President's permission, I'd like to yield the floor to the Senator from Essex, Senator Ingalls.
Senator from Chittenden Southeast yields to the Senator from Essex.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Senator from Chittenden. I'm covering sections 34 through 36, with the section 34 being titled Replacement of the Current Vermont State Standards. The agency will be preparing replacements to the current Vermont State Standards and related documents in accordance with the last transportation bill. It requires that the agency provide an oral update on the replacement process to House and Senate Transportation by February 15, 2024. Section 35 is a survey that is going to it requires the agency, in partnership with regional planning commissions, to conduct a survey of municipal support for the creation of a bicycle corridor that is roughly adjacent to US Route 5, border to border. The survey needs to address the level of interest of municipalities and regional planning commissions and prioritizing the bicycle corridor, including looking at the cost of creation and the benefits to the tourism industry. Report on the outcomes of the survey is due to the House and Senate Transportation by January 15, 2024. Section 36 is a section that we spent a lot of time on last year, but we really didn't feel that we really got anywhere. So we put a lot of emphasis with the leadership from our chair, and it really had to do with the amount of bicycles that we were and other micro mobility modes of transportation. We were incentivizing to get them out on our roadways, but we really didn't feel that there was enough emphasis on safety or whether we even had safety. And so it's a micro mobility safety education program. Requires the agency, in consultation with stakeholders identified by the agency, to develop a comprehensive micro mobility safety education program with an emphasis on bike safety. That report will be done by the, that report is going to be back to us by January 31st, 2024, and it will be reported to the House and Senate committees. And with your permission, Mr. President, I'd like to cede the floor back to Senator Chittenden from Chittenden.
Senator from Essex yields to the Senator from Chittenden Southeast.
Chittenden from Chittenden. Thank you, Mr. President. Section 37, 38, and 39 I'll be speaking to next. This Section 37 is the extension of the P3 sunset, extends the sunset of the authority for the agency to enter into defined public-private partnerships, also known as P3s, for 3 years. So we're extending a sunset to do that. So this will go until July 1st, 2026, and it makes other technical changes. This would actually is partly driven to extend the sunset so that when we look at charging stations, welcome centers, this will enable those types of public-private partnerships over the next 3 years. Section 38 are repeals, repealing obsolete and preempted law and the authority of the Transportation Board to determine connection of passenger trains, obsolete language related to municipal authority, to restrict the use of covered bridges. This should have been repealed last year when the transportation bill moved the municipal restriction of covered bridges language from Title 19 to Title 23. It's now addressed in Title 23 and 24. Section 39 are the effective dates, all on passage except as noted in sections. I think Section 37 being one of them. At this time, Mr. President, I'd like to yield the floor to the Senator from Grand Isle, Senator Maza.
Senator from Chittenden Southeast yields to the Senator from Grand Isle.
Mr. President, there you have the Senate Transportation bill presented to you today. I can tell you, of all the bills that I reported over the years, I'm very pleased with this one. Because of the federal funding, there's more money for towns, and that's one thing that we've always heard about. Towns need help on their local funding projects, whether it's bridges or there's their grants from the state. And so this spreads it out throughout Vermont. I want to thank the EG folks who testified. Boy, they had a wide range of folks that testified. And I want to thank the committee for their hard work. and dozens of witnesses. I could read them off, but I wouldn't do that for you. But we had dozens of witnesses. And let's not forget the Legislative Council, all the wonderful work they did and all the numbers they have to come up with and the research. And so we think we presented a thorough bill to you folks today, and we hope it meets the needs. And for that, Mr. President, I thank you very much.
Now you've heard the report of the Committee on Transportation. The bill was then referred to the Committee on Appropriations, which considered the same and recommends that was then reported to the Committee on Finance, which recommends that the bill, when amended, ought to pass. Now for the report of the Committee on Finance, Senator from Chittenden Southeast.
Thank you, Mr. President. Your Senate Finance Committee considered this bill, mostly focused on the mileage-based usage fee, our sections that was spoken to by the senator from Washington. The committee voted 6-0-1 favorably and encourages this body to concur.
The bill was then referred to the Committee on Appropriations, which considered that when amended, the bill ought to pass. The report of the Committee on Appropriations, the Senator from Caledonia.
Thank you, Mr. President. The amendments that are being proposed by your Senate Appropriations Committee can be found on the top of page 2049 in today's calendar. As I had mentioned in the budget presentation yesterday, there's an interplay between what we did in the budget and the transportation bill, and this is where you see some of those intersections. In order to support the level of paving and the projects that were in the book, as was shown to you by the Senator from Washington, we actually increased, we provided the funding through our cash fund to support paving in the amount of $3 million. The budget as originally proposed by the administration actually had general fund going directly into the transportation plan. We did not want to have that to be the case and created this cash reserve with a more expansive use. And so that is how we're dealing with the paving budget that's being requested. And then making it clear that $3 million, where the source of that money is coming and from what sub-account. And then we struck out section 3, and then we did a one-time appropriation. And what we have here is also related to the cash fund for capital investments. And this is in our contingent sub-account, $3.5 million to provide the necessary financing for the construction of a replacement garage in St. Albans. And then the third, included in that third instance of amendment is the $1 million that we're appropriating. There was a proposal for $3 million. We did $1 million out of that cash fund as well. We do know that there is the possibility or that some federal money can be matched with that state dollars. And so this cash fund is the source of the $1 million that could advance the work of the Rail Trail Community Connectivity Grants. The vote in Senate Appropriations was 6-0-1.
So now the question is, shall the report of the Committee on Transportation be amended as offered by the Committee on Transportation? Are you ready for the question? Senator from Windsor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Is this an appropriate time to ask about the underlying bill?
The current question would be relating to the appropriations report, so the Appropriations Committee amendment. So if it is related to that amendment in the underlying bill, it would be more fitting. It might need to wait. Question is, shall the report of the Committee on Transportation be amended as offered by the Committee on Appropriations? Are you ready for the question? If so, all those in favor, please indicate by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed indicate by saying nay. The ayes have it, and you amended the report of the Committee on Transportation as offered by the Committee on Appropriations. There's now another amendment, I believe, to be offered. The Senator from Essex.
Thank you, Mr. President. There is an amendment that could be followed along on page 2050 in today's calendar. It's not often that we have something like this come before the Senate, and We do at times sell state assets. I know in institutions, we get authorization from this body to sell buildings. We might sell other things. Nothing that comes to mind that probably as grand as what we have. But we have the opportunity. We've been approached by a company that would like to possibly purchase the Caledonia State Airport. Boy, when that comes up, it's probably pretty big news. And the first thing that comes to mind is what kind of reception are you going to get from a community? And I think that the reception that we've received in Caledonia County has been nothing but spectacular. Cautiously optimistic, but people recognizing that on something like this, especially with the possibility of one of the companies that might be interested in it, what it could possibly bring to the area as far as economic growth and opportunity. I will start going down through the amendment on Section 5. The agency of Section 5A, subsection A, the Agency of Transportation is authorized to solicit proposals for the purchase or lease of the Caledonia County State Airport located in the town of Linden. And the agency shall consult with the town of Linden on any request for proposal related to the purchase or lease of the airport prior to the issuances of any request for proposal related to the purchase or lease of the airport. Subsection B, subject to obtaining any necessary approvals from the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, the Vermont Secretary of Transportation, as agent for the state, is authorized to convey the airport property by warranty deed according to the terms of a purchase and sales agreement through a long-term lease. Subsection C, any such occurrences shall include assignments of the state's interest in easements, leases, licenses, and other agreements pertaining to the airport's acceptance of the state's obligation under such lease agreements, under such easements, leases, license, and other agreements that require at a minimum that any leases that are in effect at the time of the conveyance of the airport are fully honored for the balance of the lease terms. Continuing on, it ensures that anybody who purchased this property currently addresses such deficiencies and necessary repairs so that there's not purchasing something and just not keeping up with the operations of what a successful airport should be. Which leads us to, it ensures that the airport continues to be a public use airport. That was very important to the community, for all the people who over the years have made investments in hangar space and airplanes and such. It also ensures the airport continue to be identified as public use airport within the National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems till at least 2050, subject to federal determination. And it also includes that the airport is conveyed through a purchase and sale agreement a right of first refusal for the state to repurchase the airport should the entity that does purchase the airport not succeed. The state's interest is not to get rid of the asset so much as it is to make it a great sale that will benefit the community that the airport now serves. The agency shall also not move forward with the sale of the airport unless it gets fair market value. And also, the town of Linden has asked that they be stakeholders to have the opportunity to review and comment on the final purchase and sales agreement or lease if applicable. And this isn't an open-ended deal. There is one company that has expressed interest, but it doesn't mean that the state wouldn't get other offers from other interested parties, and anybody who is interested will have the ability to be a part of that discussion. But it isn't open-ended. The state is asking that if any purchasers are going to move forward, that they do so by May 1st, 2026. Thank you, Mr. President.
So the question is, shall the Senate further amend the report of the Committee on Transportation as amended? Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor, please indicate by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed indicate by saying nay. The ayes have it, and you have further amended the report of the Committee on Transportation. The question now is, shall the bill be amended as offered by the Committee on Transportation as amended? Senator from Windsor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to rise in support of this bill as your co-chair of the Climate Solutions Caucus. I was pleased to see the amount of investment that the agency's original budget proposed and the work that we saw on the House side. As you may already know, transportation accounts for our largest carbon emitting sector as a state, with over 40% of our emissions coming from transportation. So I wanted to rise in support of that. I do have one question on a section, but before I do that, the other thing I wanted to note was a heartfelt thank you to the Senate Transportation Committee for continuing the work that happened in the House around the Route 5 bicycle corridor study. That has been a thorn in the side of Windsor County for longer than I have been alive. So thank you for investing in bicycle safety and that work, although I know it is not common for us to study in the T-bill a particular section of road for this type of project. I had one question, if I could interrogate the member who presented on section 13.
The senator from Washington is interrogated.
Thank you, Mr. President. How many towns or organizations will likely be able to receive the $500,000 allocated? What number of projects for microtransit proposals will likely receive funding?
Mr. President, I can't answer that question. I don't remember. It depends on applications that they get. I know that there are several towns interested in microtransit, but this innovation grant program can do other programs. They could do van pools or other whatever the communities bring to the Agency of Transportation. So it could be a couple, it could be one, it could be more, depending on what kind of requests they get.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Bennington.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wonder if I can inquire of the senator from Essex, reporter of Section 6A.
The senator from Essex is interrogated as a reporter of Section 6A.
Mr. President, did I hear correctly that the people of Bennington support this?
Yes, Mr. President. In testimony, we had heard that that this was supported by the people of Bennington. We did not directly have anybody come in from Bennington to tell us that, but the information that we had gathered from AOT had said that this was something that they had supported.
Mr. President, I wonder if this section was in the other bill as it came over from the other body.
I would have to get back before third reading on that. I can't remember.
I believe that the answer is no, it's not. And the Bennington representative actually took it out of the administration plan. President, I thank you, Senator from Essex. I raised this issue because we have the James Jeffords Welcome Center in Bennington. And part of the plan was, and I know you've been there, been to Bennington many times. Part of the plan for something like was that it would provide an access to the Welcome Center from the south. But if you've ever heard the saying, you can't get there from here, that is true if you're coming from the south to the James Jeffords Welcome Center. You would have to go east on Route 9, pick up Route 279, and take that for about 2 miles to get to the Welcome Center if you were going east. If you were going north, you would have to go north to the Shaftesbury exit 2, turn around and go back south to the James Jeffords Welcome Center. And I think when we remove this from the plan, that issue would not become the forefront. I'm very concerned about that. For that reason, I would hope that as the committee works on this issue, that they would take a look at the access to the James Jeffords Welcome Center. Thank you, Mr. President.
The senator from Chittenden Central.
Thank you, Mr. President. May I inquire of the presenter of the section on on charging, EV charging stations? I don't remember which section it was in the bill.
I believe maybe that's a senator from Washington, but I'm not positive. Maybe a senator on the committee might indicate senator from Washington is interrogated as a reporter of the section of the bill.
Thank you. I'm wondering if this section provides any money or any requirement for electric vehicle charging stations at multi-unit dwellings and/or rental properties.
Thank you, Mr. President. If we're referring to section 15, where we talk about the incentive program, this is on page 2024, the answer is no, other than in the past, we have appropriated money specifically for multifamily buildings. I don't know if all that money has been spent, so it could be that there's still ongoing work to specifically address electric charging in those places where they may or may not have a designated parking spot. But we have talked about that in the committee as a need, and there has been money in the past. I don't recall having new money. There is money, I'm being told. But I don't recall there being new money, but maybe there was.
Thank you.
The question is, shall the bill be amended as offered by the Committee on Transportation as amended? Senator from Franklin.
Thank you, Mr. President. May I inquire of the presenter from section 5, I believe, Essex?
Senator from Essex is interrogated as a reporter of the section.
First of all, I'd like to thank the Transportation Committee for their great work on this. Not a difficult question here, but not being familiar with the whole process. I see that there was a bridge project that was canceled and an additional project that was added on in Sheldon. I guess my question would be, Mr. President, is how was that decision made or determination made, and with who, and is it done in conjunction with the town select boards in this particular case?
Yes, it was. It made by the town, how it was presented to us, it was made by the town and by AOT, and it was agreed upon mutually between the both of them, Mr. President.
I thank you, member from Essex. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Wyndham.
Thank you, Mr. President. May I inquire of the reporter of section 31, which I believe is the senator from Chittenden.
Senator from Chittenden Southeast is interrogated.
Thank you. My question is on page 2045, and it's in regard to the schedule of complete streets reporting. I appreciate the addition of reporting the analysis of the department on, did I say clean streets? Okay, complete streets. Sometimes I say complete streets. And my question is, will the posting and availability of the determinations be made in a point in the schedule so that the local government or perhaps some other entity could address any deficiencies that are identified by that determination?
Mr. President, I do not have a good answer for that question at this time, but I commit to bringing a thorough response back to third reading if that would be satisfactory to the senator.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yes, it would. And thank you to the...
The question is, shall the bill be amended as offered by the Committee on Transportation as amended? Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor, please indicate by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed indicate by saying nay.
Nay.
The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it, and you have amended the bill as offered by the Committee on Transportation as amended. The question now is, shall the bill be read a third time? Are you ready for that question? If so, roll call has been requested by the senator from Grand Isle. The question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Are you ready for that question? If so, the secretary shall commence to call the roll.
Senator Baruch.
Yes.
Senator Bray.
Yes.
Senator Brock.
Yes.
Senator Campion.
Yes.
Senator Chittenden.
Yes.
Senator Clarkson. Senator Collimore.
Yes.
Senator Cummings.
Yes.
Senator Hewitt.
Yes.
Senator Hardy. Senator Harrison.
Yes.
Senator Hashim.
Yes.
Senator Ingalls.
Yes.
Senator Kitchell.
Yes.
Senator Lyons.
Yes.
Senator McDonald.
Yes.
Senator Mazza.
Yes.
Senator McCormack.
Yes.
Senator Norris.
Yes.
Senator Perschlick.
Yes.
Senator Ron Hinsdale.
Yes.
Senator Sears.
Yes.
Senator Starr.
Yes.
Senator Pihovsky.
Yes.
Senator Watson.
Yes.
Senator Weeks.
Yes.
Senator Westman.
Yes.
Senator White.
Yes.
Senator Williams.
Yes.
Senator Renner.
Yes.
Senator Clarkson. Senator Hardy.
No.
Senator Clarkson.
Yes.
Please listen to the results of your vote. Those voting yea, 29. Those voting nay, 1. And you've ordered third reading of H 479. That brings us up to, I believe, S 141. S 141 was read the second time and third reading was ordered. Are there any amendments to be offered before third reading? Seeing none, please listen to the third reading of the bill.
S 141, an act relating to approval of the charter of Fairfax Fire District Number 1.
Now you've heard the third reading of the bill. The question is, shall the bill pass? Are you ready for the question? If so, all those in favor, please indicate by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed indicate by saying nay. The ayes have it, and you have passed S 141. We now have up for consideration H 110. Third reading was ordered. Are there any amendments prior to third reading? Seeing none, please listen to the third reading of the bill.
H 110, an act relating to extending the sunset under 30 VSA 248A.
Now you've heard the third reading of the bill. The question is, shall the bill pass? Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor, please indicate by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed indicate by saying nay. The ayes have it, and you have passed H 110. We now have up for consideration H 150. Third reading was ordered on H 150. Are there any amendments prior to third reading? Seeing none, please listen to the third reading of the bill.
H 150, an act relating to approval of an amendment to the charter of the Village of Alburgh.
Now you've heard the third reading of the bill, and the question is, shall the bill pass? Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed indicate by saying nay. The ayes have it, and you have passed H 150. We now have up for consideration H 288. H 288 was read for the first time, referred to the Committee on Judiciary, which considered the same and recommends that the bill ought to pass. Please listen to the second reading of the bill.
H 288, an act relating to liability for the sale of alcoholic beverages.
Now you've heard the second reading of the bill. For the report from the Committee on Judiciary, the Senator from Chittenden Central.
Thank you, Mr. President. Over the summer and fall, I spoke with many panicked bar owners who could not get liquor liability insurance in Vermont. Many landlords required this in order to operate a bar in their building, and one of the things that this bill would do is make liquor liability insurance mandatory for the owners of bars and clubs. Liquor liability insurance is there to protect people if they are injured due to negligence on the part of the owners or staff of a bar or club. And it does make common sense for these establishments to have this type of insurance. However, due to both an unfriendly insurance market or a hard market and Vermont's high insurance service ratings, there may only be one company currently that will provide these policies in Vermont. And we know that when there is a monopoly, it's not friendly for competitive rates, as there is no competition. The current ISO rating in Vermont is the highest rating that there is at a 10. And we heard that the surrounding states are in the 5 to 7 range, which makes Vermont a particularly unattractive market for insurers. We took up H288 to try and make Vermont's market for liquor liability insurance more friendly while also protecting the public. This bill makes it clear that the section of concern in the underlying law, which has been interpreted to have been a strict liability standard, is now clearly a negligence standard. Under strict liability, all that needs to be proven for liability is that an injury occurred and the facts of the case are true. Due to how easy a case under strict liability is to find a person liable for damages, insurance companies are at higher risk and thus set rates very high. This bill will move us to a negligence standard that requires 4 things for a person to be found liable. 1, that an injury occurred. 2, that there was a standard of care under the reasonable person standard, which means that you must compare the action to how a reasonable person or persons in the same situation would have acted. For example, if I'm a bartender and I serve a patron who is stumbling and slurring his words, would a reasonable person have taken the same action? 3, that a breach of the standard occurred, that they knew or reasonably should have known that a person was injured or caused injuries should not have been served in this instance, and 4, that there are damages to be awarded. There are these are the basic prima facie tenets to prove negligence under the negligence standard. We heard from the Department of Liquor and Lottery about the training that they offer all licensees in order to ensure that they have adequate tools and skills to detect if someone is impaired and to know what a reasonable amount of consumption would be. The hope is that this will change our ISO rating from an unfriendly 10 to a more friendly lower number in line with the surrounding states to make the market friendlier and drive down the cost of these liability policies. For comparison, the only other state in the country with an ISO rating of 10 is Alabama. And just last week, their governor signed a similar bill into law that would change their standard from strict liability to negligence. The bill also grants rulemaking authority to the Department of Liquor and Lottery and the Department of Financial Regulation to develop rules regarding this mandatory liquor liability insurance, including setting minimum rates. The bill, except for Section 2, which is the section on mandatory liquor liability, shall take effect on July 1st, 2023. And Section 2, the mandate on liquor liability, will take effect on July 1st, 2024, to give the Department of Liquor and Lottery and the Department of Financial Regulation time to adopt these rules, to give time for the market to hopefully stabilize and become more friendly for insurers, and for the new rolling licensure process to begin at the Department of Liquor and Lottery. We heard from Tucker Anderson, Legislative Counsel at the Office of Legislative Counsel, Kevin Gaffney, the Commissioner at the Department of Financial Regulation, the Insurance Division, Karen Jacobs, the Manager at Delhi 126, Chris Carr, the owner of the Pickle Barrel, Brandon King, the Executive Officer of Compliance and Enforcement with the Vermont Department of Liquor and Lottery, Wendy Knight, Commissioner of the Department of Liquor and Lottery, Charles Martin, the Government Affairs Director at the Department of Liquor and Lottery, Emily Morton, the Manager at Delhi 126, Adam McCrassen, Lobbyist, the Vermont Association for Justice, Tom Schurer, Advocate, Vermont Association for Justice, Amy Spear, the Vice President of Tourism at the Vermont Chamber of Commerce, and Megan Sullivan, the Vice President of Government Affairs with the Vermont Chamber of Commerce. The committee vote on H288 was 5-0-0, and we ask for the body's support. Thank you.
The question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor, please indicate by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed indicate by saying nay. The ayes have it, and you've ordered third reading of H288. That now brings us to H230. 230 was read for the first time, was referred to the Committee on Judiciary, which considered the same and recommended that when amended, the bill ought to pass. Please listen to the second reading of the bill.
H230, an act relating to implementing mechanisms to reduce suicide.
Now you've heard the second reading of the bill. For the report of the Committee on Judiciary, the Senator from Chittenden Central.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll pause just a moment to allow the handouts be distributed. Mr. President, H230 is part of an ongoing and comprehensive look at our gun safety laws that the Judiciary Committee in the Senate and in the other body have been conducting for the last handful of years. We have talked twice in this chamber so far this year about gun safety laws. S3 and S4 passed to the other body. H230 is perhaps the most far-reaching and effective, potentially, of any of the three. But make no mistake, they go together as a comprehensive approach. If I may, Mr. President, I'll begin with a confession. When I was growing up, I grew up in farm country where the fields all around us were corn and beans, and hunting and shooting were big occupations. And my father, who was a veteran, had guns in our cellar on a rack, 2 rifles and a handgun. And he would occasionally take us out to shoot with them, taught us gun safety, and told us we were never ever to take the guns. But the guns weren't locked up, and my brother was 2 years older than me, and he was the mischievous sort. And so we knew we were going to be punished if we took the guns, and that lasted for about 5 years. And then when my brother was 12 and I was 10, we started a process of when my father would leave, we would take his service revolver and we would take the ammunition that was stored in a drawer beneath it, and we would go into the field and we would target shoot. And we never took enough ammunition to be caught, and we were very, very lucky that nothing ever happened, and we were never found out, of course, before today, because my father will read the story of this coverage, and he will then know that we didn't listen to him all those years ago. With that said, I want to stress how lucky we were. We didn't, in anger or in mistake, turn the gun on one another or any of our friends. We didn't use the gun in a moment of despair or suicidal ideation. We were the lucky ones. But the Judiciary Committee heard, I would say, some of the most affecting testimony that I can remember about people who were not lucky. So I have a little trouble with it because some of those people are in the chamber with us. So I will just say that the concept of suicide in Vermont is one of the most underreported and underattended problems that we have. And although we have findings in the bill, I just wanted to quickly give you a couple of top numbers. According to the Vermont Department of Health, there were 142 suicide deaths among Vermont residents in 2021. That is the largest number and the highest rate of suicide deaths ever recorded in the state. It is on the rise. Suicide is the 8th leading cause of death in the state, and the rate of suicide increased 16% from 2020 to 2021. 91% of firearm deaths in Vermont are suicides. And we had testimony from Dr. Rebecca Bell, who is a trauma surgeon, and she told us that when people use firearms, they are almost always successful. There's an extremely low survivability rate, whereas when people attempt suicide through other means, there's a much higher survivability rate. So suicide is a problem in Vermont, and we are an outlier in that area. You might ask why, and the experts don't have a definitive answer, but they say it has to do with the fact that our population is older, and we have a high proportion of vets, and we have very easy access to guns. When you put those things together, we have a 30% higher suicide rate than other states. 30%. That's a problem that must be addressed, not that should be addressed. So with that said, Mr. President, I just want to point out that when I mention statistics, we're talking about reported statistics. Representative Black, when she came to our committee, pointed out that after their family lost their son, she found out through word of mouth that there had been several other deaths within a few minutes of her house in the same way. that hadn't been reported that she hadn't known about. So I think it's fair to say that when we talk about these statistics, we are talking about the tip of the iceberg. The problem is much larger. With that said, Mr. President, this bill consists of three major parts, and they are major pieces of gun safety legislation. There is a safe storage provision, sometimes called child access prevention. And I will just say here that we are the only state in New England that does not have some form of child access prevention law. The only state in New England. There are half the states that have some form of this, 25 plus the District of Columbia. But this bill also contains a 72-hour waiting period, and the 72-hour waiting period will be familiar to those of us in the chamber other than the number 72. We passed out a 24-hour waiting period a few years back, which was vetoed, and I would point out it was vetoed at the very last moment by the government. And at that point, we all made a vow to get it done, and that is what we're attempting today. The last part of the bill is an important change to the extreme risk protection. If you are not familiar with those orders, they cover a moment where in current law, a state's attorney or the attorney general feel that there's evidence of an extreme risk that a person poses with a firearm to themselves or to others. And they can go and get an order issued to have those firearms confiscated. The change we're contemplating here is to broaden that somewhat so that family members who have evidence that there's a risk to self and others can also apply for one of those orders. So with that said, Mr. President, I will turn to the bill. And the bill begins on page 2052 in the calendar. I won't reiterate the findings except for one. If you look at the top of page 2053, you will find this one sentence finding. Children are 4.5 times more likely to die by suicide in a home with a firearm compared to a home without a firearm. That is a fact, and it is deeply disturbing. As a parent, I take that to heart. Mr. President, if you look at section 2, legislative purpose, at the bottom of that page, the other body moved H230 first through their Health and Welfare Committee, and wisely so. It is a public health crisis, suicide by firearm in our state. And they themed the bill around suicide prevention. And again, I think that's the number one purpose to be accomplished here. But your Senate Judiciary Committee felt that the bill was a little more broadly based than that, that some of the provisions will prevent community gun violence in other areas. And so that first sentence of the legislative intent now reflects that slightly broader theme. The purposes of this legislation are to prevent death by suicide, by reducing access to operable firearms by children and prohibited persons, and to reduce community violence. With that said, Mr. President, if senators would turn to the next page, section 3. This is what is commonly called safe storage. Our committee, after much deliberation, instead of the precise model that the House had used, we made a small change to bring the legislation in line with what is known as the New Hampshire. So in New Hampshire, which currently has a negligent firearms storage law, they have set it up slightly differently than appeared in the House bill. But before I get to the nuts and bolts, I just want to say, Mr. President, I have had thousands of conversations about firearms with thousands of people in the state of Vermont. Many of them with an undertone of anger as they confronted me for working on the issue. I would say that in all of those cases, when I talked to people about safe storage, they were very quick to immediately say, in my home, all of my guns are securely stored. I have trigger locks, I have a gun safe, etc. Half of those people, I would say, thought that safe storage made sense and should become law. But the percentage of people who didn't feel that it should become law, what they rested on was the idea that it was a personal decision. Now, I think there's two ways to look at that. One is that it's in their belief, guarded by the Constitution, but also in their belief it's a personal decision whether someone chooses to securely store their weapon. Problem being, for the child who gets the gun and hurts another person or themselves, it's not a personal choice. That gun is what in the law we refer to as an attractive nuisance. It almost is designed to attract a child in the same way that a swimming pool does. And that's why we have zoning around swimming pools. That's why we need some sort of protection for weapons that are loaded and easy to hand. The other thing that I would say, Mr. President, about safe storage and just generally this bill in terms of constitutionality. The Bruin decision, the most recent court decision, has thrown a lot of things into doubt, and case law is catching up with that somewhat disruptive court decision. But in 2008, there was a decision in the Supreme Court known as Heller. And the Heller decision offers this line on safe storage. After making a case for the right to personal defense, the justices said, quote, "Nor correspondingly does our analysis suggest the invalidity of laws regulating the storage of firearms to prevent accidents." So based on this and other signs from the Supreme Court, the Judiciary Committee feels that we are going to be within constitutional muster on these provisions. So if senators would look at section 3 at the top of the page. I want to be really clear on this next point because senators have probably received on the order of hundreds of identical emails making the argument that there is no way to enforce this safe storage provision. And that argument, I believe, was not true with regard to the House bill either, but it had more of a footing with the House bill than it has with the New Hampshire model. So under this model, the only thing that is being criminalized is an insecure storage of a weapon that is then used to commit a crime. So if a crime is not committed, there is no crime, there is no penalty for not safely storing the weapon. So if I can walk through this, a person who stores or keeps a firearm with any premises that are under the person's custody and control, or who knows or reasonably should know that a child or prohibited person is likely to gain access to the firearm shall be, and it gives the penalties, both penalties have an if in the middle of the clause. If a child or prohibited person gains access and uses it in the commission of a crime or displays it in a threatening manner, that would be the misdemeanor. If a child or prohibited person gains access to the firearm and uses it to cause death or serious bodily injury, that would be the felony. But there is no misdemeanor, there is no felony if there is not a subsequent crime using the gun. Prior to that second subsequent act, there is no criminal penalty here. Then below that are some further exceptions. This section shall not apply if the firearm is carried by or within such close proximity that it can be readily retrieved and used by the owner or another authorized user. If you are in your home and you have a firearm, even if that firearm is loaded and you have it within your reach and someone snatches it from you and commits a crime, you are not liable. You are not penalized. If the firearm is at some distance from you, you're in the basement and in the attic you have an unsecured firearm and a child does something with it, then you are not carved out under this provision. If someone breaks into your home, illegal entry, and takes your firearm and does something with it, you are not liable. If a child or prohibited person uses the firearm during a lawful act of self-defense, you are not liable. And then the most important one, in my opinion, is D. If the person stores or keeps the firearm in a locked container or equipped with a tamper-resistant mechanical lock or other safety device. Now, what's important here is that in the House bill, it required that in order to be exempted from the penalty, your gun would have to be unloaded and locked up. The Judiciary Committee felt that if the gun was going to be locked up, for instance, in a safe, there was no need to require that it be unloaded. So you can, under this legislation, have a gun safe with a loaded gun in it that only you know the combination to. We had testimony from people who talked about that method of storage, that they use it and they can, within 3 seconds, have their weapon in their hand. And the reason why I think that's crucial is, again, back to the Heller case, the 2008 Supreme Court case, that was litigated specifically over self-defense. This bill bends over backward to protect the right to self-defense, even to the extent of allowing a loaded weapon that is locked up. That will not bring you a penalty under this law. And moving down the page, you'll see in subsection B1, this is a requirement that federally licensed firearm dealers post warnings that a user may be subject to prosecution if they don't securely store their weapon, and giving them access to resources for suicide prevention phone lines. And I would just point out there that when we passed S10 that had the provision prohibiting guns in hospitals, we required signage there to make clear our actions, and we're doing a similar thing here. That, I believe, completes what I have to say about safe storage. If senators will look down at the bottom of page 2055, this begins our work on the extreme risk protection orders. We also have relief from abuse orders in statute, and the definition for household members that you see here mimics the definition in relief from abuse statute. This is slightly narrower than the relief from abuse statute in that it covers people who are currently engaged in a sexual relationship, a dating relationship, living together, residing together, but not if those relationships were in the past. Whereas the relief from abuse order also includes past dating and sexual relationships. On the facing page, Mr. President, 2056, the basic change that we're making here to the extreme risk protection order is that we are adding a family or household member to the list of people who are eligible to apply and start the process for an extreme risk protection order. What I would say about an extreme risk protection order is that it's meant to provide emergency, immediate relief in the event that someone can provide evidence that a person with a firearm in their household is a danger to themselves or others. And those have worked very well since we put them into place. We have about anywhere between 15 and 30 of them a year that are used. And we have not had complaints about their use. That's part of the thinking and why we're extending it to household members. We're also thinking about situations where a state's attorney is not to be found, or the attorney general is not to be found, and the clock is ticking. You'll see that what we have done, if we are expanding the access, we are also tightening the standard for those new people who can access the extreme risk protection order. And if I can, I'll go there, Mr. President, and that I believe is the next page, 2057. You will see that your Judiciary Committee, by a narrow margin, voted to hold, if a family member or a household member asks for an extreme risk protection order, this legislation would ask that the standard be a clear and convincing standard of evidence rather than a preponderance, which is what the state's attorney or the attorney general would face if they went with it. That was after much discussion in committee, and we were of two minds about it. But I will say that the thought, the argument presented in favor of this was that if you had a household member who was not being opposed by a witness, because this is an ex parte hearing where the person the order is addressing is usually not there, there should be a higher standard of evidence if they are not an elected official like a state's attorney or the attorney general. That being said, there is a second hearing 2 weeks later, and that is a permanent hearing. And at all of those hearings, it is a clear and convincing standard. That moves us to section 7, and that is the firearm transfer waiting period of 72 hours. Why 72 hours? I think there are a couple of good answers to this. The best is that of the states that have waiting periods, 72 hours is the weakest waiting period. It is the least amount of time that any state has for its cooling off period. And what that means is that there is significant and weighty research about 72 hours, showing that it is associated with drops in homicide incidents and suicide. When we passed the 24-hour waiting period legislation, ironically, Governor Scott vetoed it, and one of his reasons for vetoing was that there was no evidence on the books that a 24-hour waiting period would help. Now, we had adopted the 24-hour waiting period to make it more palatable to the governor. So, bad on us, and we are fixing that problem now by going with the standard that all of the evidence suggests is the most effective, and that is 72 hours. Senator Vyhovsky also pointed out that in our mental health system, involuntary holds on a patient are 72 hours, so it tracks well with that thinking. You will notice that in the waiting period, we've incorporated the narrow Charleston loophole that we, along with the governor, worked out a while back, so that it's 72 hours after your background check comes back, not to exceed 7 business days, which you might remember was the compromise the legislature worked out with Governor Scott. That being said, Mr. President, there's only one other piece that I need to point out, and that is at the bottom of this section, you will notice that under section 7, subsection E1, this section shall not apply to a firearms transfer at a gun shop. Now, Mr. President, this is a 1-year provision with a sunset, and that's meant to allow gun show operators or people who have already begun planning for a gun show in Vermont that this 72-hour waiting period might affect. It's to allow them a year to adjust to the new reality, at which point you will see on page 2058, this subsection shall be repealed on July 1, 2024. There is a severability provision in the event that some piece of this is challenged and found to be unconstitutional. The other pieces would remain in force, and you will see that the act would take effect on July 1, 2023. Mr. President, I'll just end where I started, and that is that the Judiciary Committee, I commend our chair, Senator Sears. He has been trying very hard to square his own feelings about guns with his own belief that our laws need tightening, and he has helped us in many ways find workable compromise, and that's what this bill represents. So with that said, Mr. President, we voted this out 4-1-0, and we would ask for the body's support. Happy to answer questions.
The question is, shall the Senate adopt the report of the Committee on Judiciary? Senator from Rutland.
Thank you, Mr. President. May I interrogate the reporter?
The senator from Chittenden Central is interrogated as the reporter of the bill.
I'm curious whether there were statistics that showed how many deaths by suicide by firearm, were by firearms that were purchased within 72 hours and firearms that were actually owned by people already.
Mr. President, we did not have that statistic, but I know that the national research shows that when you adopt a waiting period, 72-hour minimum, there is a drop in suicide deaths, and there's also a drop in homicides.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Bennington, the senior senator from Bennington.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to just thank Senator Chittenden as well as other members of the Judiciary Committee for their work on this bill. Over the years, my general thought was to support bills that would keep firearms out of the hands of people who should not be able to possess firearms, such as persons with domestic violence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'd like to speak to those senators right now who may be on the fence on this bill, either because they think it goes too far or it doesn't go far enough. I would point to the model of the safe storage. When I heard about New Hampshire, I decided to read New Hampshire and Maine's laws, and quite frankly, this before you on safe storage is very similar to what Maine does as well. So the three northern New England states would be joined. I don't think this, as the senator from Chittenden explained, I don't think this is a overly burdensome requirement. And quite frankly, it's common sense. So I started out in opposition to the idea of safe storage, particularly because I didn't know how we would enforce it. But I found myself, as we worked more and more on the bill, in strong support of it. Regarding the extreme risk protection orders, I would urge folks to understand that they are extreme risk. And when we passed the bill a few years back, in both the Senate and the House, there was not one no vote on the extreme risk protection orders bill. That is historic in terms of any firearm legislation in this state. In other words, Mr. President, no one opposed the extreme risk protection orders that we put together. And part of the reason, I think, was that we were wanting to make sure that they were rarely used, but only used when there was an extreme risk. And I think the committee, the majority of the committee, saw that by adding clear and convincing for the family member, we keep that strong idea alive that there must be some extreme risk shown by clear and convincing evidence. To make sure that, because it is an ex parte hearing, to make sure that folks' rights are protected. I do not support the waiting period because it's 72 hours, and I think that's too long. That's my personal opinion, but I voted for the bill. And I won't quote Meat Loaf now since I was quoted yesterday, but really 2 out of 3 ain't bad.
Senator from Bennington.
Thank you, Mr. President. May I inquire of the presenter?
The senator from Chittenden Central is interrogated as the reporter of the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. I should know the answer to this, and it might seem a bit silly, but on the section around safe storage, what is a firearm? And what I'm asking, there are just a lot of things out there that people use to keep animals off their property. Kids have BB guns, things like that. And I'm just wondering if you could clarify that for me.
Sure. If senators will look on page 2055, there is a standard definition of firearm that is imported into all of these bills. It's subsection 4017 of this title and 13 VSA. And it includes everything that you would think of as a firearm. It excludes antique firearms. So long ago, that definition was wrestled over and determined, and it now exists as a standard in all of the gun safety bills.
Great. Thank you, Mr. President, and thank the Judiciary Committee for the work on this bill.
Senator from Essex.
Thank you, Mr. President. Out of respect for the guests that we have in the chamber today, I probably won't talk much directly about this bill, other than this bill isn't much about suicide other than it's just anti-gun. The funny thing about statistics is that sometimes the statistics are, they can be one way or the other depending on who likes to bring them forward. There's all kinds of statistics about what the values of guns are for personal protection. And I think probably most of the provisions in this bill will be struck down by the Second Amendment, who guarantees our right to bear arms. But I also understand the passion of folks. I actually understand the passion of the presenter of the bill, our Senate Pro Tem. I'd just like to point out that there's other things that I'm passionate about. One of them being the deaths that we see from drug use. I wish that sometimes, Mr. President, that we could get behind something like that more than doubles and triples the amount of people that are killed every year in our state, but yet we seem to relax the rules and sometimes celebrate the rules as of things to I just wish that we'd be tougher on some of those other things, on things that we could easily change and impact and save lives. And so with respect to the people in the gallery, I appreciate that you're here today, and I'm sorry that you've gone through with what you've gone through. I don't know if this is the bill that's going to help you ease your pain of what you've been through. I'd like to see us be more serious on other things in this Senate that we can control effectively loss of life. And I don't know if this bill does that. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Windsor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Many of us in this chamber have been working on these issues for a long time. The 72-hour waiting period and the safe storage or negligent storage provisions are ones that are near and dear to my heart. They're inextricably linked. And the more time and space we can put between people and access to a firearm saves lives and prevents more people from acting on impulse. The first time I was introduced to the need for this state to have a safe storage law was a long time ago. As an issue was when many of you may remember, when UVM professor Ji Woo came to this body, came to the legislature, and asked us to enact a safe storage law in response to her teenage high school student son taking an unlocked firearm from a neighbor's house and committing suicide behind his high school. That was 12 years ago. It was 13 years ago. I keep forgetting we're in 2023. That was 13 years ago. Many people in this chamber worked hard on that law and that work for the next several years. This bill, we are finally acting on Ji Woo's request. I'd just like to have you think about that. It's taken us 13 years to get to this point. 24 other states require safe storage of some variety, and there are many more in progress. So I'm channeling Ji Woo today. I'm also channeling, likewise, extending the waiting period to 72 hours is very meaningful to many of us here, and a meaningful improvement to Vermont's firearm safety laws. In July of 2014, my husband's beloved colleague and our dear friend, Cheryl Hannon, committed suicide with a firearm she purchased the day before. Who knows if more time had been put between that purchase and her ability to use that firearm? Who knows? But who knows if it would have been sufficient? But we can only hope. We can only hope that her mental health needs would have been addressed and that her family would have intervened. I urge this body, in honor of Ji Woo and Cheryl Hannon, to pass this bill, H230, on a strong yes vote. Thank you.
Senator from Addison.
Thank you, Mr. President. May I inquire of the reporter of the bill?
Senator from Chittenden Central is interrogated as the reporter of the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just have a question about the section on the extreme risk protection order. And I'm wondering if you could give an example of a difference between the preponderance of evidence and a clear and convincing evidence. How do they differentiate in the availability of evidence to reach a conclusion?
Right, so never having, Mr. President, been a judge myself, I have talked to Judge Zone, among others, about this. From what I understand, a preponderance of the evidence is a bare majority. 51% of the evidence leans this way. Clear and convincing is somewhat higher. Now, what would be an example of clear and convincing? We asked this exact question in committee. So let's say a household member comes forward. They have to fill out an affidavit, but affidavits are one means of evidence. So are the facts as described in the affidavit clear and convincing enough? Do they have reference to a third party who can back up the elements of the affidavit? Is there physical evidence if somebody, for instance, has been struck or some of those things? So I can't tell you precisely, but I will quote Eric Fitzpatrick, who always says, this is radically fact specific. In other words, each case would be a different example, and it would be judicial discretion whether it hits clear and convincing.
Thank you. I thank the presenter. Well, Mr. President, I first want to, at the risk of getting a note from a senator in front of me, want to thank the Judiciary Committee for their work on this bill, especially the chair, who I know has struggled with this issue for a very long time. And I am thrilled and impressed to see a bill this strong come out of our Judiciary Committee. As the senator from Windsor talked about the 72-hour waiting period, that is something that many of us have worked for a number of years, and I am extremely happy to see it in this bill. I think the safe storage provision, or the I'm not sure exactly what it's called in the bill now that I'm talking, but is an improvement. I wish it were a bit stronger, but I'm happy to see it in there. And one of the things I think that we need to remember is about the gun violence that we're seeing in our communities, in our state. Just a week and a half ago, during a devotional on the floor of the Senate,
I believe a sign fell off the wall.
okay, that was dramatic. But just a week and a half ago in this chamber during a devotional, we were told about an incident that happened in Morrisville in Vermont that involved a family member taking another family member hostage and then shooting at police officers who came to the scene. I believe it was in Morrisville. And I was worried when I heard our devotional about that. And it was an important reminder that gun violence happens in our communities in Vermont. And then the other thing that's happened over the last few weeks that's really disturbing to me, and has happened just over our border and could have very well happened in the state of Vermont, is that someone, a young person, turned into the wrong driveway. Yes. A wrong driveway. A young person the age of my own kids turned into the wrong driveway and was shot dead for turning into the wrong driveway because someone had easy access to a firearm. And that has happened in state after state after state over the last few weeks, where young people turn into the wrong driveway, open the wrong car door, knock on the wrong house door, and they are shot just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And this is an epidemic, a terrifying epidemic in our country. And we should be doing every single thing possible to stop this from happening. So I'm really pleased to see this bill. My one concern is about the thing that I just asked the presenter of the bill about, is the difference between clear and convincing evidence and preponderance of evidence when it comes to an extreme risk protection order. Because as we've seen, as the first example I talked about in the town of Morrisville, gun violence in Vermont is often between family members. Domestic violence is the second most likely type of death by firearm in Vermont after suicide. And that is, as definition says, somebody in the same household and the same family. And we often need family members to protect themselves and other family members by asking for an extreme risk protection order. And I know the senator said that something like elected officials should have a lower standard, and I actually think that is absolutely wrong. Family members, if anything, should have a lower standard because they are the ones who are living in the house with the person. They are observing the behavior. They are observing the fear and the behavior that may lead to a firearm violence. And so that is my major concern in the bill. And I hope that after we see this in effect and we have more data on the number of extreme risk protection orders that are denied or accepted, that we can relook at this. But other than that, Mr. President, I am extremely happy with this bill, and I again thank the senator from Bennington for his good work, and the senator from Chittenden, and all the members of the Judiciary Committee, and I am excited to vote yes for this bill finally. Thank you, Mr. President.
The question is, shall the bill be amended as offered? Senator from Windham.
Mr. President, may I read from a letter I received from a constituent who is also an emergency room physician?
Without objection, you may.
Thank you. As an ED physician, I have borne witness to the terrible toll that firearms have taken on Vermonters when misused. I am also a hunter and firearms user. I do not believe that H.230 will restrict the rights of Vermonters to access and use firearms in a responsible manner. I urge you, he's speaking to me, to support H.230. Vermont suicide death is higher than the national average among all age groups. Many suicide deaths are preventable. The vast majority of those who survive a suicide attempt do not go on to later die by suicide. Firearms are the most common method used in suicide death in Vermont, more common than all other methods combined. Household firearm ownership levels are strongly associated with higher rates of suicide. The likelihood of a suicide attempt resulting in death is most strongly predicted by lethality of the method used, not on the degree of intent. Firearms are the most lethal method used in suicide attempts. Many suicide attempts are impulsive acts triggered by a brief crisis. Restriction of highly lethal means can lead to fewer suicide deaths due to delay or substitution of less lethal means. No single intervention will solve the problem of suicide in our state. However, requirement of a waiting period to purchase firearms and safe storage of firearms in the home help to address the proven connection between impulsivity, access to firearms, and suicide deaths. So that is what I received from a constituent. Hopefully other folks received it also, who is an emergency room director. He's the chief medical officer of the hospital where he works. Those are his words. In my words, in my family, we have had 2 suicide deaths by firearms, one 36 years ago and one 3 years ago. I know that the first would have been at least delayed if there had been safe storage. The second one, probably not. But I would say preventing even one of those deaths would be worth our time. And I thank the committee very much for the bill.
Senator from Franklin.
Thank you, Mr. President. May I inquire of the reporter of the bill?
the senator from Chittenden Central is interrogated as a reporter of the bill.
Mr. President, this is as much a technical and procedural question as any. In the issue of issuing temporary ex parte extreme risk protection orders, there is mention at the top of page 2057 that the petitioner shall cause a copy of the order to be served on the respondent, and the court shall deliver a copy to the holding station. It goes on to say in new language in subsection B, the court shall transmit a copy of the motion to the state's attorney once it's issued an ex parte order, along with supporting documents and the notice of the initial status conference and hearing. The question is, as envisioned, how does the respondent get a notice of this? I'm assuming it says that the petitioner shall cause a copy of the order to be delivered. And how do the firearms that are involved get seized, and who's responsible for doing that? And how long does it take?
So again, Mr. President, the idea behind the emergency extreme risk protection order is that there is a pending emergency. And so an ex parte hearing means that the person who's being discussed is not there. So in a majority of these cases, the person is not notified before the hearing of the emergency hearing. And it may be that the first knowledge they have of this is when the order, like a subpoena, is brought to their door. We have a legal order here to collect your firearms. That may be their first contact. The question of who is the petitioner changes if you, if folks will look on page 2056. So if the petitioner is a family or a household member, after the ex parte hearing, the state's attorney becomes the petitioner. And that then routes it into the normal course of the extreme risk protection order. So the state's attorney will make sure that the respondent receives, in good faith, receives this information and the file. When I say in good faith, the court will use the last known address of the person, and they will attempt to get in touch with them. Sometimes that is not successful. So it is the case sometimes after an ex parte hearing that the person, that the respondent in the hearing does not receive the material because nobody knows where they are. In 2 weeks, there's a permanent hearing. If they're still not there, that permanent ruling can go 6 months before the process has to go again. So there are continuing attempts made to send to the last known address of the person. But the process of taking the firearms does not wait for them to receive, because often in such cases they are perhaps fled or not available.
What I'm trying to understand is the technical aspects of the process. Who does these things? Who is it who has the responsibility for notifying the respondent to in the ex parte situation? Is it the court, or is it the state's attorney who has now taken over the role of the respondent?
It is the court, Mr. President. And I will check on that, but I'm almost certain, so that when the ex parte hearing with the household member as the petitioner goes forward, there's now an order that's been issued, and the court will, again, use the last known address to try to get that to them. And then no later than 7 days later, the state's attorney becomes the plaintiff in the case. And so the court is, as with other legal notifications, that's on them.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I'm presuming that it is the court then that contacts the sheriff or some law enforcement agency to go and seize the firearms that the respondent has. And what do they do with them?
Well, there are different possibilities. One possibility is that the law enforcement agency that's involved can store the firearm. The other possibility is, and we've had discussion about this in this chamber, But current statute provides that a relative of the person whose guns are seized can store the firearms. There has been discussion of changing that piece of the statute, but that's as it currently stands.
Since the existing statute has been in place in terms of seizing firearms, is there any history of which the reporter is aware of whether or not this is working, whether or not it is working in a timely fashion, and whether or not the firearms are in fact seized timely?
Well, I would say that we did not receive any testimony about the process of seizing the firearms not working. But senators who have been here a while will remember that there was a repository where the state of Vermont was storing weapons, and it turned into a mini debacle because they were being stored improperly, and then the state wanted to get out of the business of storing weapons. So now I believe it's being done on a more local level.
Okay, and there's essentially no information one way or the other as to whether that process is working as intended?
I would say, in fact, that it is working. The testimony we had from the judiciary, among others, about the extreme risk protection order was that it was working very smoothly. And so the discussion was how to extend it to family members without disrupting that smooth function.
Thank you, Mr. President.
The question is, shall the Senate adopt the report of the Committee on Judiciary? Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise like others to thank the committee and support the bill. That said, I have had many discussions with constituents, maybe not thousands like the presenter of the bill had, but definitely maybe the dozens with constituents that are opposed to the bill. And one of the things that I have said to those constituents is that I would ask a question that kind of, a lot of these discussions, once we got past their first kind of anger that this bill is even being considered, and we really kind of dealt with what their problem was, it really was around the constitutionality of the bill. And, you know, I have my own views and disagreements with our Supreme Court's decisions on this matter, but I promised I would ask the question on what, so if I may, can I inquire if the presenter?
Senator from Chittenden Central is interrogated.
And this question is, what testimony did the committee have from our alleged counsel on the constitutionality of these provisions?
I thank the senator, Mr. President. We've had extensive testimony around the Bruen decision, the most recent. I called it disruptive earlier. I'll just repeat that, although I have other adjectives that I keep in my own mind. I would say that it's a decision that, among other things, asks us to look back to the 18th century or the 19th century for historical analogs to determine how we should go forward with gun policy. That strikes me as unwise. With that said, you'll remember when we discussed S3, we talked about the way that it would be protected, we believe, under Bruen. We don't have the clear historical analogs in this case, say for a 72-hour waiting period, although in the colonial period there were restrictions on who was owning guns, but there's not a perfect analog to that. So what I would say, and I think this is in line with what Ledge Counsel has told us all along, is that following the Bruen decision, there have been and will continue to be a series of circuit court decisions. Some of those have supported things like waiting periods, things like barring prohibited persons, like people found guilty of domestic violence from having a weapon. But there is at least one circuit in Texas which has tried to overturn that thinking and say that in the 18th century there was no prohibition on those guilty of domestic violence having a gun, and so therefore in our time we should say that those found guilty of committing domestic violence should have a gun. The long and short of it is that under Bruen we don't yet know what settled case law will be. That's why there's a severability provision contained here. Some of the provisions, extreme risk protection order, my colleague, Senator Hashim, has done a lot of work on the constitutionality of the ERPO laws, and they are on a very firm footing. The rest will need some shaking out in the courts. I did reference Heller earlier, and that was the 2008 decision that specifically said that something, a statute designed to prevent accidents with a firearm would not be unconstitutional. So operating on that and the sense from our alleged counsel that nothing here looks flagrantly unconstitutional, even under Bruin, I think that what we can say is that no one knows where the Supreme Court may go, but we do know what standing law has been, case law and Heller, and these are all in line, these sections are all in line with those decisions.
Thanks for that answer. And now I have a personal question on page 2054 on the negligent firearm storage on A to B. This is the section that says that if a child or a prohibited person accesses a firearm as a result of illegal entry, then the criminality of the unsafe storage would not take place. Like the percent of the bill, I grew up in a neighborhood where we as children did have access to loaded firearms. And we also had basically free access to each other's homes. So, you know, I would walk into my neighbor's house without knocking, and not being a lawyer or been on the Judiciary Committee, I'm wondering about the definition of illegal entry. And the example from my own experience, if I had walked into my neighbor's house, I knew where the handgun was, I could have easily accessed that firearm. So if that was to happen today with a child in my community where they walked in uninvited, would that be illegal entry? And then the owner of that firearm not be, there wouldn't be a way to prosecute that negligent storage of a firearm?
Thank you, Mr. President. If I understand the question, so this bill is designed to prevent children or prohibited persons who are likely to be in a home. So if your child has a friend and you understand them to be the child's friend, them being in your house is never a crime. You can tell them to leave, but you know, the friend of your child is not an illegal entrant into the home. So in that case, I wouldn't view B as preventing the law from going into effect if a friend of your child took the gun and committed a crime. Just to clarify, because that was maybe a little confusing. Under this bill, if you have children visiting your home and they get access to the gun, which is not in your control, and they hurt someone else with it or threaten someone else with it, you would be criminally liable.
Yes, Mr. President, I think that is clear. My example is that I'm an uninvited guest in that I wasn't specifically invited. I'm not, or this child, let's say, the child that comes over to the house wasn't specifically invited, is not accompanying the child that lives at the home, but goes to the house a lot, and so just feels comfortable walking in the door. I wondered if that would define, if they could make a defense of, well, that was an illegal entry. We didn't tell the child to enter the house. The child wasn't with my child at the time. They came into the house on their own, so therefore I'm not liable because that was an illegal entry. That's my concern about that section.
Understood. I believe that if someone, let's say a friend of your child, broke into your home while you were gone and took the firearm, that would be an illegal entry. If you're all sleeping and the child comes in because they know how to get in and where the gun is, that would be illegal entry. You see me trying to put together what I was calling the radically specific fact pattern. It is always going to depend on the actual circumstances. So if the child is a friend, they're invited there, this does not cover them. But what it does exempt is if someone who, even if they are a friend of your child and they come in uninvited, as you seem to be indicating that it would be by stealth. And if that's the case, it would be illegal, would not be exempt.
I think the presenter, I'm concerned about that section because I can see it as it happening as we talk about this being a attractive nuisance, that if they know where the firearm is and they have access to the home on a regular basis, that they would enter, and if an act was committed, that the owner of the firearm could use this as a defense for what I would consider a negligent act of having a firearm not storage properly. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Chittenden Central.
If I might, I will, although he didn't ask for it, I will commit on third reading to getting a more complete answer about illegal entry and how it would affect children.
The question now is, shall the Senate adopt the report of the Committee on Judiciary? Are you ready for that question? Senator from Orange.
Mr. President, I've lived where I was prohibited to possess and a firearm and to have one in where I slept. And strangely enough, that was in Southeast Asia when I was in the armed forces. And the policy of the U.S. Army where I served on a base that was relatively secure was that we were prohibited from possessing and carrying around and having access to firearms while on post. When we left, and which was most often by helicopter, we would unlock a Connex and take a personal weapon and carry it with us. And when we landed, that weapon went into the metal Connex and was locked and secured. The U.S. Army was not willing to grant us personal protections when we were on the base, and their rationale was the people likely to be killed on that base were likely to be killed or wounded by other fellow soldiers. That was their rationale. And I believe I was on several occasions very pleased that that was the policy. But in the most interesting part of the presentation by the reporter of the bill, was the information that spoke to the many emails that I have received in the last few weeks. And the emails over and over again, very similar, one after another, was a worry by folks that own firearms and had them in their homes that the government would be seeking to come into their house and see whether or not they were in compliance with the measure that said you should lock up your firearms. And may I interrogate the reporter of the bill?
Senator from Chittenden Central is interrogated.
I understand from your report and from, but not as well as, I don't understand as well from reading the statute as from your report, that it is not a crime in and of itself to not have your firearms locked up. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. President. The bill, when it was generated in the House Health and Welfare Committee, had such a criminal, it required that guns be locked up and had a penalty, I believe, if one didn't. Then when it moved to the other body's Judiciary Committee, they eliminated the penalty, but they retained the prohibition. So if senators will look on page 2054, section 3, 4024, negligent firearms storage. In the bill as it came over from the other body, there was a line that said it is prohibited not to securely store your firearm, and that was potentially something that could fit into the argument you're talking about in the email. That has been eliminated here. So there is no prohibition on storing your firearm insecurely. What there is criminal liability if you don't store it securely, and if it is then used in those subsequent crimes. So you are exactly right, Senator.
So I guess I'm trying to ask opinions, which is probably not the thing to ask. But may I may I conclude that the emails that I've gotten, that the government would be knocking on the door and seeking to go into your property to see whether or not your firearms were secure, were they to do that and come in and find out that your firearms were not locked up, what would the consequence be?
Mr. President, there would be no consequence unless a child or a prohibited person threatened or injured or killed someone with that weapon.
Had already done that before they knocked on your door.
Exactly.
So may I conclude that the concerns that I'm getting in the email that the government would be knocking on your door to check up on this, and that would be problematic and an invasion of your privacy and contrary to your ability to defend your home, was mistakenly founded?
You may.
Thank you.
The question is, shall the Senate adopt the report of the Committee on Judiciary? Are you ready for that question? If so, the Secretary shall, excuse me, no, there is no roll call.
Roll call, please.
Roll call has been requested, my apologies. I was expecting one.
Mr. President, if I might ask whether the presenter of the motion wishes it on the amendment or the final bill.
I suppose that would be a interrogation if you'd like to ask that question.
Mr. President, I will do it on the final bill, please, sir.
The roll call has been withdrawn, and my apologies for my inaccuracy. Question is, shall the Senate adopt the report of the Committee on Judiciary? Are you ready for the question? If so, all those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed indicate by saying nay.
No.
The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. You have adopted the report of the Committee on Judiciary. Now the question is, shall the bill be read a third time?
Roll call, please.
Who requested? Same Senator from Essex requested a roll. The question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Are you ready for that question? If so, the Secretary shall commence to call the roll.
Senator Baru.
Yes.
Senator Bray.
Yes.
Senator Brock.
No.
Senator Campion.
Yes.
Senator Chittenden.
Yes.
Senator Clarkson.
Yes.
Senator Caldwell.
No.
I'm sorry, does someone have an electronic device?
That may be mine.
Senator. Senator Cummings.
Yes.
Senator Gulick.
Yes.
Senator Hardy.
Yes.
Senator Harrison.
Yes.
Senator Hashim.
Yes.
Senator Engel.
No.
Senator Kitchell.
Yes.
Senator Lyons.
Yes.
Senator McDonald. Yes. Senator Mazza. No. Senator McCormick.
Yes.
Senator Norris.
No.
Senator Pershman.
Yes.
Senator Ron Hinsdale.
Yes.
Senator Sears.
Yes.
Senator Starr.
No.
Senator Yahowski.
Yes, with explanation.
Senator Watson.
Yes.
Senator Weeks.
No.
Senator Westman.
No.
Senator White.
Yes.
Senator Williams.
No.
Senator Renner.
Yes.
Please listen to the results of your vote. Those voting yea, 21. Those voting nay, no. And you have ordered third reading. Now for the vote explanation, the Senator from Chittenden Central.
Thank you. As a social worker who works primarily with teens and young adults, I know just how big and transitory their emotions can be. One moment it's the end of the world, and in a few hours or days, no longer a big deal. And due to brain development, this population is particularly impulsive when under duress. Further, as a gun owner myself, nothing in this bill strikes me as overly cumbersome, but simple, common sense safety measures. I'm proud to vote yes on H230 because it will save lives. Thank you.
Our next order of business is S36. S36 was passed by the Senate and referred to the House, who considered the same and recommend that when the bill amended, it pass. The bill was referred to the Committee on Judiciary, and the pending question, it was not referred to me, excuse me. The pending question is, shall the Senate concur with the House proposal of amendment? And for the report, Senator from Bennington, Senator Sears.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Senate Judiciary Committee would like to concur with further proposal amendment. Basically, the other body changed the bill somewhat by removing nursing homes from the protected group, but added EMTs. And after discussion in committee, we decided, from representatives of nursing homes, we decided that the bill was so important for those who are hospital workers and patients in our hospitals that we should move forward. So we do provide a one word amendment. That is to restore the word tumultuous in the crime. And the reason for that, Mr. President, as you know, we're lucky at Senate Judiciary. We have 2 former law enforcement officers on our committee, and both expressed concern about confusion if you take the word tumultuous out of one section of law and it's still in other sections of law. And so what does that mean in terms of disorderly conduct? So, Mr. President, our recommendation is to concur with further proposal amendment.
Therefore, the question is...
I believe that's on the calendar.
That is correct. On page 2063. So the question is, shall the Senate concur with the House proposal amendment with further proposal of amendment? Senator from Chittenden Southeast.
Thank you, Mr. President. As you may remember, S36 was a bill that Senate Health and Welfare also took testimony on and added amendments to before it went over to the House. And so we have also reviewed the bill. We do not have a further proposal of amendment. We will agree with the Judiciary Committee on their motion, but just to say that as the committee looked at what was returned to us, there was some concern about limiting and focusing on hospitals rather than a more expansive attention to other healthcare facilities. So we will be looking at that in the future. The changes that we also looked at and that we concur with relate to information that an EMT or a medical professional should supply to a public safety officer when someone is put into a warrantless arrest. So we do concur with this, and we think it's a very important bill going forward. Thank you, Mr. President.
Question is, shall the Senate concur with the House proposal amendment with further proposal of amendment? Are you ready for the question? If so, all those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Those opposed indicate by saying nay.
Nay.
The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it, and you have concurred with the House proposal amendment with further proposal of amendment. Confirmations, or excuse me, that completes yours today. Are there any confirmations to be taken up, Senator from Addison?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to move, I hope I get this right, that we suspend the rules and take up for confirmation as a group The confirmations that are not underlined, starting on page 2072 of today's calendar and going through on page 2075 through Richard Grassi of White River Junction. I believe all those after need to remain on the calendar if I'm correct. So again, starting on 2072, it would be starting with John Arison of Ascutney through Richard Grassi of White River Junction on 2075, those that are not underlined. Thank you, Mr. President.
The senator from Madison has moved that the Senate suspend its rules in order to take up and confirm all of the non-underlined confirmations found on page 2072 through 2075 through to and including, but no further, Richard Grassi of White River Junction. Are you ready for the question? If so, all those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed indicate by saying nay. The ayes have it, and you have done just that. Senator from Chittenden Central.
Thank you, Mr. President. Pending announcements, I would move that the Senate stand in adjournment until 4 p.m. today to clarify the motion for the body. This would be a pro forma session. In other words, we wouldn't be debating or passing bills, but it would allow us to advance bills and also to do administrative work, i.e. potentially announce the conference committee for the budget. So the 4 o'clock session is not something where we will be voting on bills or presenting or moving bills. It'll be an administrative session. You can be here if you choose to be. You do not need to be here. We're not bound by a quorum for an administrative session. Thank you very much.
I believe that was pending announcements.
Yes.
The senator from Chittenden Central has moved that the Senate stand adjournment until 4 p.m. today, April 28th. Are there announcements? Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senate Finance will meet at 2. We're still trying to catch up from yesterday's delayed meeting, so yeah, bring your lunch and you might get out in time for the administrative session.
Senator from Bennington.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senate Education will also meet at 2.
Senator from Madison.
I hope to do an appointment, but it sounds like people need to meet, so I will delay till next week. But we do have a number of appointments who are underlined getting me today too. So anyone who's listening, it's not because we don't want to appoint you, it's because of our time. Senate Government Operations will meet at 2 as well. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Essex.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senate institutions will meet at a few minutes before 2. We just need to figure out what we have, who we have left that we might meet with today, and we'll make a decision then. Thank you.
Senator from Chittenden Southeast.
Senate Health and Welfare will meet very briefly 3 minutes after the fall of the gavel. Give you time to get your lunch.
Senator from Caledonia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Appropriations Committee will meet at 2, grab lunch. I know some members are going to have to leave earlier this afternoon, so we at least hope to get one bill out. 2 o'clock, bring lunch. Thank you.
Are there any further announcements? I would request the senators from Grand Isle and Chittenden Central to meet briefly, considering the potential announcement later. The senator from Chittenden Central has moved that Senate stand adjourned until 4 p.m. today, April 28th. Are you ready for the question? If so, all those in favor, please indicate by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed indicate by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the Senate will stand adjourned until 4 p.m.